It's my pleasure to commence proceedings this evening. I'd like to welcome you all to a session entitled Protecting Our Environment, a Transformational Moment, a Global Reset in the Future Hope. It will be my pleasure to introduce and then interview our special guest tonight, Mr. Bob Sanford. Bob has a long history with a career in natural and human history interpretation, which led him to organizing leading a number of large-scale national water celebrations, including the 2-year United Nations International Year of Fresh Water and Wonder of Water celebration in Canada in 2003. Bob went on to chair the UN's United Nations Decade of Action, Water for Life in Canada, after which he went on to work directly with the United Nations. In his capacity at the UN, Bob was the co-author of the UN Water in the World We Want report on post-2015 global sustainable development goals relating to water. He is also the lead author of Canada in the Global World, a new United Nations expert report examining the capacity of Canada's water sector to meet and help others meet the United Nations 2030 Transforming Our World Water-Related Sustainable Development Goals. Bob is also an author and co-author and editor of more than 30 books, including Our Vanishing Glaciers, The Snows of Yesteryear, and the Future Climate of the Mountain West. Recently has just won the prestigious Lane Anderson Award for the best science writing in Canada in 2017. Bob holds the prestigious Global Water Futures Chair in Water and Climate Security at the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health, and is widely known as the Winston Churchill of water. It is my pleasure to welcome a good friend of mine and a friend of Rotary, I'm sure, Bob Sanford.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. Very kind of you. And it's good to see you, if only virtually. And I must say that it's an honor to be invited to speak to my friends and colleagues at Rotary. And many of whom, I should point out, often gather in the afternoon following their Wednesday morning meetings at what we fondly call the Georgetown Institute, which is now considered to be Rotary Canmore's ersatz university. And we've laughed heartily together there, but we have also had very serious discussions about the current state of the world and how service clubs like Rotary can help create a better future for all. And I want to thank you, Brian, for all your help in making today possible. And I'd like to thank all the members, your members, for the invitation to speak today.
Mm-hmm. Bob, you know it's a pleasure, and I'm so excited to get us underway here. Perhaps you could start by explaining your work and how, in particular, this might relate to the goals and values of Rotary and Rotary International.
I'd be delighted, Brian. Thank you. Please allow me to begin by extending to all the very best wishes of the United Nations. And in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, I wish to acknowledge from the outset that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures which constitute the common heritage of humankind. And it is to the common heritage of all humanity that I wish to direct my remarks today. More specifically, please allow me to acknowledge that I'm offering this presentation from my home in the Front Ranges of the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And I live in the ancestral territory of Treaty 7 nations of Southern Alberta, which include the peoples of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, and Tsuut'ina, as well as the peoples of the Nakota nations and the Métis. Please also allow me to respectfully submit that though I'm not Indigenous, I have certainly worked and chosen to become native to place. I have spent my entire life learning from others, including First Nations, how to understand, honor, interpret, and protect in a good way what is vital to respectful appreciation of where and how we must live among these extraordinary mountains. And I also should point out, Brian, that I'm also married to a local Rotarian who is also committed to equity and inclusion. And I would be a member of Rotary too, but the club meets at 7 in the morning, which I'm afraid, Brian, for me is the middle of the night. And I also have another problem. I do not speak before 10 to anyone, Brian. Now that said, please allow me to explain my work. I work to make the situation we are in with respect to water and water's relationship to climate intelligible to others. I translate scientific research outcomes into language that others can understand. And the only difference now is that I do it so that decision makers in the UN member states can use that language to craft timely and durable public policy with respect to managing the global water crisis and addressing water-related climate change impacts. And given that this week, March 22nd to March 29th, is World Water Week, it's most appropriate to note that the foundation of the work of the entire water and climate community begins with science. It seems to me that the commandments of science can be reduced to two: tell the truth and stand up for all humanity and for the planet now and generations into the future. Good science involves not just the sharing of knowledge about the world. It is a candle we light when we want to see and be warmed by the truth. But we know that modern science is not the only way of knowing. Scientific knowledge alone will not be enough to get us through the bottleneck in which we presently find ourselves in the human journey. It will take all the knowledge and all the ways of knowing that humanity possesses to get us through this turbulent moment in human history. More than in any time in history, we need to braid together all our ways of knowing and caring. We need to bring indigenous and local wisdom, as well as scientific knowledge, to bear on the challenge of ensuring sustainable human presence on this planet, a presence that depends on water. And that's why we work, all the work that we do together is so vitally important. So now, if I may, Brian, I'd like to relate this work to the goals of service that Rotary has for community. And I want to thank Sally Guerin for first introducing me to Rotary's remarkable ethical guide to what members may wish to think, say, and do in their personal and professional relations. What impressed me greatly was that this four-way test has been translated into more than 100 languages, thereby qualifying it as a uniquely unifying ethical principle globally, one certainly endorsed by the United Nations. And this evening, I'd like to invite Rotarians watching this webinar to personally apply this four-way test to one of the most pressing crises ever faced by the United Nations in its efforts to eliminate poverty, protect the planet, while at the same time ultimately ensuring prosperity for all. So what I'd like to ask you to do is objectively examine and evaluate the evidence I'm about to put before you regarding what we know and what we have to do to get to global sustainability within the following Rotarian context. Based on the evidence I provide, is there truth in what I'm saying? Are the measures I will present in terms of responding to what I will contend is a climate emergency fair to all concerned? Will these actions build goodwill and better friendships? Will addressing the climate and related Earth system threat be beneficial to all concerned? I ask you tonight to decide, and I hope you will follow me also as I trace the pathway I have followed through the painful situation science has put into relief with respect to the climate threat. Mine is a story of seeking and finding hope in a very difficult time for humanity and for the planet. And I hope you can also find hope in my story. And most importantly, I hope too that you will discover that there is a pathway forward, a pathway to sustainability.
Bob, you've been arguing that for some time that you believe that we are presently facing a transformational moment in terms of the future of humanity. Would you kind of play on that and give us some meaning in that context, please?
In my view, Brian, the most immediate risk is that our society will lapse into some different but still functionally unaltered version of what we had before the pandemic. And in my view, that would be a disaster leading only to the next disasters. The world shouldn't be and won't be the same again. And as I hope to demonstrate in tonight's webinar, our interest should reside in not creating the world we had, but rather in creating the world we want and the world we need to have if we are to perpetuate tolerating living conditions for ourselves and the rest of life on this planet in the future. But before I begin my journey toward hope, let's talk for a moment first about this terrible pandemic. With respect to the virus, how could we have not seen this coming? This is not the first encounter a virus has had with dense human populations, and certainly won't be the last. In a world this populous and interconnected, the threat of pandemic will always be with us. Viruses have been around for 2.5 billion years before multicellular life even came into existence. And there are 1.7 million rapidly mutating viral forms that pose a potential health threat to humanity. COVID has certainly stopped us in our tracks. The pandemic has created what I hope history will remember as the Great Pause. And like teenagers, perhaps, we're grounded until we get grounded. And the premise of my presentation tonight is that while it'll be critical to ensure we're better protected from pandemics in the future, we shouldn't stop there. We should use this extraordinary hiatus to thoughtfully consider how we can perpetuate our gains in carbon emissions reductions to counter the climate threat, while at the same time making other critical changes to our economies and lifestyle expectations. And we need to change our expectations that will make us not less vulnerable to pandemics in the future, but will bolster meaningful, persistent action in achieving the goals of the UN's 2030 Transforming Our World Global Sustainable Development Agenda. And I think there's urgency here, Brian. We need to change the direction we are going in time to ensure that we never come this close to crossing the threshold of societal collapse again. We need to use the Transforming Our World Global Sustainable Development Goals as a blueprint for global reset and the future of hope. And Rotarians, however, must be taken by just how almost completely the 7 avenues of focus that you've developed overlapped with the UN's Global Sustainable Development Agenda. In my mind, it's simply astonishing. One is completely nested within the other. Rotary and the UN have essentially the same goals.
So Bob, what in your estimation are the central problems that we face on this continent to address in order to deal with water and water-related climate changes that we as a nation face at the very beginning of this 21st century?
Well, that's an excellent question. And you've touched, Brian, on the link between water and climate. Water and the behavior of water in the global hydrologic cycle are so linked to climate that you might as well say they're the same thing. And as the global climate changes, it's vital to pay attention to what rising temperatures do to water. And it just so happens I've just completed a synthesis that seeks to offer comparative international water policy example as a guide to the creation of a new Canada Water Agency. And recognizing the central role of water in sustainability, effective 21st century water policy in this context is defined as that which proactively addresses the kinds of new and intensifying water challenges we know will demand new and different approaches to freshwater management for the rest of this century in this country. These challenges include climate change, certainly, and an attendant increase in water-related climate disasters. But in Canada, these challenges also include biodiversity loss, fragmented water governance, and unresolved and uncharacterized Indigenous water rights. Canada is a water abundant country, but it's not a water secure country. Despite the myth of relative abundance, parts of Canada are reaching what is called peak water. And in these places, we're literally running out of enough water to meet the demand of all the uses to which it needs to be put to sustain the Canadian economy and way of life as it exists today. Despite this, water quality threats are not being adequately monitored widely across the country. Groundwater contamination and overdraft are rampant widely, often in regions where it is a vital source of supply. Aquatic ecosystems, fisheries, and wetlands are under threat greatly. Water laws are out of date or not effectively or equitably enforced, and much of water's infrastructure is at or beyond its design life or not adequately maintained. In addition, new contaminants are appearing that seriously threaten water quality and raise the cost of ensuring public health. And rising energy demands are also creating unsustainable demands on water. So climate change is shifting water availability and increasing the risks of a number of things. And many of the institutions we find that were put in place in the 20th century to manage the nation's water resources are no longer adequate. And it's for this reason we're in the midst of creating a new Canada Water Agency to address these water policies and to make Canada as a whole more sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Bob, there's so much out there for us to kind of pull apart and get our wrap our mind around. What is happening that is new with respect to climate change in Canada that we should be concerned about here?
Well, let's begin with the known and related risks that a high planetary fever poses now and will pose in the future here and in Canada. Our first consideration is the effect of warming atmospheric temperatures on how much water the global atmosphere can transport. For every degree Celsius the climate warms, the global atmosphere can carry 7% more water vapor. Raise the temperature of the global atmosphere 4 degrees and it will carry 28% more water vapor, which would disrupt the entire global system. A 4-degree temperature increase would in fact change the world. And since we discovered atmospheric rivers, climate change has been described as a tsunami in the sky. More water vapor in the atmosphere is making storms more powerful, heat waves more intense, and drought deeper and more persistent. And the rate and manner in which water moves through the global hydrologic cycle is accelerating. All the parameters we thought stable have already begun to change, and this means that we're soon going to enter a new biogeochemical reality as it pertains to water. So we're witnessing extraordinary changes. The rapid melting of so much glacial ice is creating more liquid water, which is evaporating faster into a warmer atmosphere capable of transporting more water. To keep up with these changes will require a mindset shift. We need to start thinking of the global climate system and the colossal energy, mass, and biogeochemical exchanges between the oceans, the atmosphere, land, snow, and ice that power that system as a planetary freshwater source. We, to be honest, had no idea of how much a little warming would impact the environmental systems upon which we depend for the social, economic, and political stability of our global society. Warming temperatures have caused a cascade of impacts, including Arctic warming, disappearing sea ice, changes in jet stream behavior, and destabilization of the global climate, all of which are beginning to take a big toll. We're already seeing the mounting economic costs of that destabilization in Canada, the United States, and around the world. In Canada, 9 of the 10 disasters with the highest insured damages have occurred in the last decade. And to Quebec, it cost the country more in the past 10 years than in all the natural disasters cost in this country combined since Confederation. At $95 billion, the US suffered the most expensive year in terms of damage from natural disasters in the country's history. At the same time, they were battling COVID. And globally, the world's 10 costliest weather disasters saw insured damages of $150 billion. And note that the difference between insured and uninsured, we have no idea of what uninsured losses are, but they are projected to be orders of magnitude greater.
Mm-hmm. Bob, you're putting a lot of emphasis here on hard earth science. How much of this needs to be taken up by the membership of Rotary, and why do I need to know that?
Well, mostly because you're thought leaders and opinion leaders. We need to know this because Our society needs the guidance that only trusted people can offer. And Rotary is filled with people who are smart and successful leaders, all of whom have committed their lives to equity and inclusion. Rotary, I've noticed too, is alive with elders with tremendous life experience. And right now our youth need the benefits of that experience. And many of us, certainly in my generation, were born in a geological epoch called the Holocene. Geologists have marked the Holocene as unique because of its relative climate stability. It was this stability that allowed our civilization to come into existence. But many earth scientists now believe that we live in, all of us, a new epoch, the Anthropocene, a geological period marked by the realization that humanity has become a major geological force in its own right on a planetary scale. The Anthropocene is seen as an epoch in which Earth system decline is on collision course with the elastic ethics of our time. It's seen as an epoch in which the warnings of experts have been insufficient in comparison with the scale of the crisis we now face. And as successful people who care about community, we look to Rotarians for wisdom and support in tackling the great problems in our time in service of a brighter future. And this is one of them. So the threat, in my view, and the view of many climate scientists, is that what we face is existential in nature. If we don't act now, we could soon live in a world so changed that much of the history, literature, and culture that has enriched our lives may no longer be relevant anymore, because the landscapes upon which our heritage was established will have changed. The places that we so love, the places in which we have established our identity and sense of place, may no longer be as we knew them ever again, and we as people may not be the same again. Indigenous people know that addressing these matters is a matter of cultural survival. Most of the rest of us don't see it that way yet, but addressing these threats is a matter of cultural survival for all. And what's interesting is children and youth have begun to see this, but children, in the absence of effective adult action, should not have to stand up alone for the planet on these matters. So that said, I firmly believe that we can understand the global problem we face and that we can address it, and we can do so in a way that will benefit and improve the lives of all.
Bob, carrying on that train of thought here, how can we, the members of Rotary, explain the situation we face in a way that will bring understanding and compel others to action without frightening or angering them?
I think it's fair to say that we can now explain what's happening, but it may be hard to do without causing at least some alarm if we don't also arrive at hope. So please let me outline the path I took to work my way through alarm to hope, and how I explain the climate crisis so others can share and act on that hope. The first thing that needs to be explained is that unfortunately, one crisis does not end because of the arrival of another. The COVID crisis is now colliding with the climate crisis. And in the meantime, symptoms of climate change are only getting worse. Now, there's an interim vaccine for climate change too, but for it to work, we have to take it. And there's a lot of anti-vaxxers who don't want it and many who won't. And the pandemic has shown us that at least one climate vaccine might work, and that vaccine is carbon neutrality. In January 2021, it was reported that US greenhouse gas emissions fell 10.3% in 2020, the largest drop in emissions in the post-World War II era. Now, this, of course, is a direct consequence of the unplanned economic slowdown and other costs associated with corona-induced lockdowns around the world. So herein, the bad news, and despite dramatic emissions reductions, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere continues to rise, and the impacts of climate disruption continue to compound. Now, I just want to warn you here that this is where it gets scary, but if we want to arrive at hope, we have to first cross this difficult terrain. As Winston Churchill once said, if you find yourself in hell, don't stop. And it's the duty of everyone alive today to avoid anything remotely resembling hell on earth in the future. So please, participants, I ask you not to despair. We'll get you through this. We have to know honestly what we have to face and get through if we are to arrive at hope. And as I said, carbon dioxide concentrations in the global atmosphere continue to rise despite the effects of the pandemic. That carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has continued to rise despite our unplanned and abrupt reductions in carbon emissions suggests that feedbacks have been initiated that will result in increases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere unless we are able to get ahead of rising global temperatures now.
Bob, I have to ask then, why are these feedbacks of such concern, and what feedback loops concern you the most, and how might they impact us?
Well, let me begin by explaining feedbacks and tipping points. Feedbacks occur whenever warming causes more warming. When warming begins to become self-perpetuating, the effects can be irreversible and that they lead to tipping points in natural systems. So let's go back to water. How water responds to temperature perfectly demonstrates the non-linearity that occurs in natural systems and how that non-linearity expresses itself by way of tipping points that result in step-like system change. So think of it this way: when the temperature of ice rises from minus 50 degrees Celsius to minus 10 degrees Celsius, little happens. Nor does much happen when the ice reaches minus 5 degrees Celsius or even minus 1 degree Celsius, even though the temperature has changed by 49 degrees. But warming it just one more degree and the ice literally changes state. It becomes water. There's also a second higher temperature threshold that once reached turns liquid water suddenly into the vapor that literally disappears into the air. So they're discovering that there are tipping points like this widely in the Earth system, including the climate system and also concerning ocean acidification. Everything stays stable through a range of changing conditions until an invisible threshold is crossed and literally all hell breaks loose. And we don't know enough about the Earth system to know where all the tipping points are. These feedback loops are creating themselves faster than science can keep up. And our greatest fear is that we won't know where they are until we've already crossed them. So hence the need for real precaution. And there's also evidence which suggests that several of these tipping point phenomena could interact, which is to say they can feed one another. And then if a threshold in one system is crossed, there exists the possibility of a ripple effect causing thresholds in other parts of the system to be crossed also. And Brian, this is exactly what we're seeing in our own Arctic. Well, recent research suggests that we don't have to worry yet about massive releases of methane from the floor of warming polar seas. The greenhouse release feedback caused by permafrost thaw in our Arctic has the potential to become a tipping point for the entire global climate. And we call this Arctic amplification. And because of unprecedented warming in the past 2 decades, the staggering scale of thawing in the permafrost has turned the Arctic into a carbon source instead of a carbon sink. As one scientist put it, because of permafrost thaw, the Arctic has become an enormous carbon chimney. And though you can't see it, the carbon chimneys that flying permafrost have created have, in effect, industrialized the Arctic. By way of global warming, we have turned parts of the tundra into the equivalent of a planetary internal combustion engine. And this is the feedback we don't want to get away on us. We need to keep that carbon where it is in the ground. Now, these new risks to the planet should challenge conventional wisdom on fighting climate change. Most countries are approaching the climate problem as though it were a linear problem. Reduce the emissions and we'll solve the problem. Now, that may have been true 20 years ago, but it isn't so now. The effects that scientists warn were in the future 20 years ago have arrived just as predicted, and policymakers no longer have the luxury of focusing predominantly on reducing carbon emissions because we've already entered climate change's dangerous next phase. So as we've seen, governments can learn through experience, like with COVID, with individual disasters like COVID, that we also learn that we're almost never ready for a new combination of disastrous events. Indeed, even a world where climate risks rarely interact, governments are already inadequately planning for potential disasters. And as these risks increasingly compound one another, governments will lag ever further behind, making carbon emissions reductions targets harder and harder to achieve. Now, here in Canada, for example, we know that if permafrost thaw continues at even current rates, the national goals for carbon emissions will continue to be moving targets. And because of permafrost thaw and other feedback releases, Canada's stated goal of exceeding our 2030 emissions reductions target and net zero carbon emission by 2050 will recede beyond our grasp. And that's why, it's for that reason, Canada needs to take its responsibility for dramatically reducing our country's carbon footprint seriously when it submits its national net zero plan at the UN's next convention of the parties scheduled to be held in Glasgow this November. Canada should unfold its plan in lockstep with the new net zero plan developed by the Biden administration. Now, all national plans, however, have to demonstrate that we've reached the most important tipping point of all, Brian, our tipping point, the point at which enough of us see that we are at a point of no return with respect to climate disruption, and finally take collective action before it threatens human presence on this planet. And I believe that moment could be now. And it is in realization of that that hope resides. We have shown that we can adapt to a crisis like COVID. Can we do the same now for climate change? Yes, we can. All we have to do is want to. And now is the time to want to. But to do so, we have to be clear about what we need to do.
Mm-hmm. Bob, Rotarians understand these challenges, but they often find them awkward to bring up, especially when the people with whom they are sharing their knowledge do not subscribe to evidence of the climate threat. Is there a way of presenting what we have outlined in a way that provides a win for the water community, a win for those we serve, and a win for the world?
I think so, Brian. First of all, it's really important to never allow people to tell us it's too late. We cannot allow it to be too late. We are on the steepest learning curve we've ever been on, but we're finally getting the message that human health equals planetary health. And the first thing we should take heart in is that we're gradually making a transition in our society from generating and defending evidence of why we need to address the climate threat to having some of the most powerful and innovative minds in the world, shifting the conversation to how we should address the climate threat in ways that will not destroy the global economy by way of energy transition. And as the likes of Bill Gates have clearly indicated, it will not be easy. We have some of the technology to make it possible, but there are also technologies and particularly ways of organizing ourselves that need to be invented if we are to become net carbon zero globally by 2050. But Gates states very clearly, whichever nation gets to that sustainability first and helps the rest of the world do so also, that nation will become prosperous indeed. And while we wait for those technologies and more ways of efficiently working together, we have to rely on what we're learning about how the Earth's biodiversity-based planetary life support system itself can help us get us through this bottleneck in the human journey. Fortunately, Brian, we do not live in a Petri dish. If we did, we probably would be finished by now. And herein resides hope. We share this dish with other beings, and it is they who are saving us from ourselves. We share the earth with the living world. Constructed over billions of years, our biodiversity-based life support system is remarkable and complex beyond imagination. The living earth can be our ally and our partner in reversing the damage we have done to our only home. What this tells us is what we need to do is restore the world and bring long-term sustainability back to the Petri dish. And to do that, we need a new narrative. Planetary health provides that narrative. To restore stability to our planet, we must restore our planet's biodiversity. It's the only way out of the crisis that we have ourselves created. We must restore and rewild the world while at the same time build water security into a new global narrative about the future. And the thing is that we face too many problems to deal with them one at a time. Reclamation, restoration, and rewilding are solutions that address many problems simultaneously. By tearing down trees, burning forests, dredging wetlands, and plowing wild grasslands, we have released 2/3 of the carbon that historically was sequestered in natural systems. And I mean sequestered, I mean stored. That suggests if we restore our forests and wetlands and bring back the carbon capture capacity of the Earth's grasslands, we can put all that carbon back where it once was, in self-regulating natural systems. The best way to bring the Earth back into climate equilibrium is to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And this is the foundation of what we mean by carbon sequestration. Carbon drawdown cannot occur without biosequestration. By renewing nature's processes for sequestering carbon, we can store carbon in life. And I understand that Rotary is involved in projects that do that. By reclaiming, restoring, and rewilding the world, we can not only reverse the damage we have done, but we can also stabilize the global climate. And because reducing the climate threat is only one benefit of doing this, arguing on behalf of restoration can create a better, safer, healthier world for all has the advantage of being something to which even the most entrenched climate denier can hardly object. Rewilding and restoration of natural system function also allows us to step back from the potential unanticipated and unintended consequences of climate intervention that are being proposed, but are not solutions, but are threats in themselves. Instead of proposing that we madly pump dangerous sulfur compounds into the upper atmosphere or install mirrors in space, we first see if the Earth itself can help us restabilize the climate of this planet. We need bio-geoengineering, not more mechanical geoengineering madness. We have been defrosting the polar refrigerator. To refreeze the Arctic, for example, we know we need to reduce our emissions of heat-trapping gases, and we must be serious about that. But that will not be enough. We cannot halt permafrost thaw directly, but it may be that we could do it by restoring and rewilding the world. Simply bring back the trees and the global forest will absorb 2/3 of the carbon we have emitted, and bring back biodiversity, and it will do what it does best, stabilize the world. Now, in this respect, it's not out of the question that in the end, saving the Amazon could save the Arctic. If we take care of nature, nature will take care of us. We also need to restore our soils. The top 20 centimeters of soil on this planet is all that stands between us and self-extinction. We have created a chemical agriculture in the 1970s, and as a result of that, we have since lost 1/3 of the world's topsoil. The United Nations predicts that at our current rate of soil loss, the remaining topsoil on this planet will be gone in 60 years. In other words, unless we do something, we'll only have 60 harvests left. Only a shift to restorative agriculture can prevent this from happening. To save ourselves and our planet, we must harness the regenerative power of the Earth itself. The soil will save us. Without drawdown, we face climate chaos. Through drawdown, however, we can slow, halt, and reverse climate disruption. To do so, we must fully utilize the most powerful carbon drawdown technology on the planet, photosynthesis. Through restorative agriculture, the soil will save us. We must also apply the restorative imperative to our oceans. We are now turning the global ocean into a plastic broth. We can restore the health of the global ocean by way of the creation of marine protection areas that cover 1/3 of the planet's oceans. We also need to make changes in the way we live. We need to create a circular, no-waste economy. We have to learn again how to give back as much as we take. We have to reestablish reciprocity as a foundation of balance, while at the same time repaying our debt. We must not focus on what we're going to lose by changing our way of life, but on what we are going to gain. In giving up our domination of nature, we win the world. We must aim high, not just for the world we need, but the world we want. We have a plan, we know what to do, we just have to do it. We know now what Indigenous people have known for thousands of years. We can reduce and moderate the threat of climate disruption by protecting, restoring, and constantly rehabilitating natural system function. And from this, we see that it's not the end of the world, it's just the beginning of another. And perhaps because we're so connected people today, as this pandemic has demonstrated, we have expanded capacity to think in terms of community, not just in thinking about ourselves. And I submit to you, Brian, that there is the greatest of power in realizing this, for it is the local level where we live, the level at which Rotary functions, that we have the most power to affect change and to act most effectively in service of where and how we live and who we love now and in the future. We have before us a moment during which we can turn this great pause and this catastrophe that caused it into an opportunity for global reset and the emergence of new hope for the future. But to make that transition, we have to act on behalf of that hope. The mobilization of hope is a precondition of effective action. And in this emergency, simple idealism can still prevail. If people cooperate, they will achieve better outcomes and more durable solutions than they can on their own. It is not irrational optimism to believe that cooperation can change and even save the world. It's not irrational, it is simple common sense.
Bob, as we look ahead to a changing political environment right now, the U.S. is signaling its intention to rejoin the Paris Accord. This is a time of renewed excitement about the future. I understand that the UN is leading a number of initiatives focused on restoring natural system function. As our time comes to an end, might you offer some final observations on where hope resides and where this transformational moment might lead us?
We need to establish a reclamation and rewilding imperative powerful enough to save ourselves and to save life on Earth. And to that end, the UN is calling for a restoration imperative. And such an imperative goes beyond environment. It would demand that we first restore local identity and humanity's sense of place and connection. It demands we restore truth, restore responsibility to human dignity, economic morality and equality, and in so doing, restore common purpose and a vision for the future of humanity and the planet. But most urgently, such an imperative must become an immediate, effective vehicle, not just for the protection, but for the rapid restoration of critical natural system function so that we can restore balance in the world and step back from the climate crisis. And in all of these matters, Rotary has a role to play. We're at a crossroads. We're running out of time. We need to get on top of this pandemic and get ahead of climate disruption before it gets ahead of us. Unfortunately, we live in one of the places in the world where we can still do that. But to create and have that hope, we need to work together, all of us. In his landmark last book, Horizon, Barry Lopez offered that what we urgently need now is a second, new, and very different enlightenment, an enlightenment of the Enlightenment, if you will. But no enlightenment can proceed without a renaissance. And it's worth reminding ourselves that humanity's first renaissance was born in Italy following an epidemic of Black Plague in the 14th century. Maybe this is time for another. We, all of us, need to be that next renaissance, to be that new and wiser beginning. So if there is ever a time for fearless leadership and informed and relentlessly courageous citizenship, it is now. If there was ever a time that we need all of us to apply our own four-way test to all that's happening, this could be it. A better world is possible, and Rotarians know how to create that world. To create that better world now, we need to engage our clear-sighted, enthusiastic, informed, and articulate youth. We must invest in and unleash the energy and enthusiasm of the next generation. They are our hope for the future. Rotary is certainly on the right track. Keep doing what you're doing. This is a transformational moment, however, not just for those who care about water and climate and social justice. But for all of us who care about the future, let us seize that moment. Let that renaissance begin here, now. Thank you, Brian.
Bob, thank you very much for taking us through a complex narrative that is part science and part poetry. Mother Earth, it's all we have. We do have time tonight for some Q&A, some dialogue. So I'm going to check the Q&A section here to see if there are any questions here. I have one here, Bob. It says, how do you answer the question that the world's climate has always been changing? It's never been static or perfect, and that CO2 has in history been much higher than today.
It has been, and the answer to that question resides in rate of change. We are now, as I indicated in my discussion of the Anthropocene, experiencing changes in the Earth system, including the composition of its atmosphere, more rapidly than in any other known period in geological history. What we have done in the last century would have taken millennia to have occurred at any other time, even during rapid deglacial periods. It resides in rate. And also the second thing is, we know, and we have been through this through 5 assessment reviews by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change that have been asked that question. And each of the 5 times that we have inverted the entire scientific process, we've arrived at the same answer. The reason why that rate is so rapid is because of the amount of carbon dioxide that we have put into the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. Right now, we look at it, and a quarter of almost all of the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere, we put there. And also now, people have also said, well, what about volcanic eruptions? We are now generating more carbon dioxide ourselves than we normally get from volcanoes by a factor of 200 times. So it's rate, and it's we have got more and more clear evidence and more substantive reinforcement of that evidence of the fact that this is a very unique period, and that we are the influence that we need to take care of to make sure that it doesn't cause us societal collapse.
Bob, another question here from our friend in Banff, Hugh Pettigrew. We were informed 20 years ago that our Bow River is losing, or was losing, 1% volume per year due to climate change. Where are we at, 80% or worse?
Well, actually, I'm not sure about that information. We've dealt mostly here with declines in flow as a result of glacial recession. And we have noticed a substantial decrease in some of the flows. One of the things that's really interesting related to that is that what we have seen is very interesting effects of warming on snowpack and snow cover, not just on glacial contributions to that river. But we have seen, for example, that since the 1960s, the snowpack and snow cover in the valley floor have been reduced by 40%. On average. So the snowpack in the lower valleys is diminished, and the flows and contributions are being spread out over the longer period. And also we're finding that while snowpack and snow cover are holding up at altitude, the changes in the valley floor are quite something. And finally, one other thing that you might be interested in is that one of the things that the 60 years of research at Marmot Creek Basin in Kananaskis by the Global Water Futures Group has shown is that we have been able to absorb a 4-degree temperature increase, predominantly in winter, because of natural system stability without any major hydrologic changes so far. And we don't know how far that will go until we get a step-like change, but it's really interesting to see how our proximity to the Canadian Rocky Mountain Parks World Heritage Site has made such a difference to slowing and moderate climate effects in this part of the world.
Mm-hmm. Bob, I have one here from Canmore, Terry and Martin Bean, who kind of anticipates something you and I were talking about in terms of rolling up our sleeves. Martin once says, thanks for the great presentation, Bob. What are things, easiest things that we can do to implement at our local household? I mean, how do we start incrementally? I know I don't want you to get into a whole shopping list, but you know, I can see Martin already. He wants to go tomorrow. So what would you tell him?
Well, it's really interesting. You and I have had this conversation about how important Rotary is and how much it could actually do. First of all, I think Rotarians, if they know the facts, this is really, really important. Climate science right now is under attack by the poisoning and weaponization of social media to advance the cause of denial. And right now we know that 1/2 of all Canadians and Americans, for them, social media is the only source of news that they get. And 1/4 of all of the tweets about climate change on any given day are by misinformation bots. Again, applying the 4-way test to what you hear is absolutely critical. And again, just to speak to his point, when people hear the truth from people they know, it matters. We really count on the people we know to inform us, and it matters which way you can direct people. The second thing is the political influence that Rotary has. Rotary has strong political connections, and you can make systemic change higher profile, and you can make it possible. And also, you can support meaningfully sustainable projects that advance the global restoration imperative. And finally, I think, again, it's important to recognize the power that you have to build a bridge to youth. These are not people who are just our future. In a very real way, they are potentially an aggrieved party. For them, this is a social justice issue. So truth matters to them, but also I remember in the 60s, Brian, as we discussed, you know, we wanted to just tear down the whole system. You know, we wanted revolution. These young people don't want revolution, they want transformation. And when I was their age, we wouldn't talk to anybody over 30. These people will talk to anybody that makes sense. And I think we need to reach them, and Rotary is a perfect vehicle for doing so.
Bob, looking at higher order, Trevor Axworthy is asking locally, can the new Canada Water Agency move policy on the dying of Lake Winnipeg and coal mining on the eastern slopes? That's a lot of geography.
Well, and then that geography is all connected. I've been working for 15 years on Lake Winnipeg, and everybody says, well, why are you doing that? You live in Canmore. Well, the river that flows by our houses here in Banff ends up in Lake Winnipeg. And so consequently, what is really important here is that we're connected as a basin. Now, can a Canada Water Agency help with this? We have cooperative federalism as a structure of government in Canada, which means that the federal government has limited power over provinces. And after 1930, they had limited power over what the resources management plans in provinces would be. And the answer is, yes, we need to strengthen that, or we won't be able to manage issues like we're the only G7 country in the world doesn't have an integrated flood and drought prediction system. We face real problems with biodiversity loss. We face real problems, as the questioner will note, with toxic algal blooms. And we have to start realizing that transboundary waters affect everybody. Coal mining in the front ranges of the Rockies, especially where they plant it, with the risk that runs with selenium and other contaminations, is a tremendous risk for everybody downstream, and particularly, and first, the extraordinarily well-developed irrigation systems that produce an enormous amount of this country's food. And the damages that we might do to surface and groundwater with these types of things, these types of rather short-sighted and rather backward proposals, could impact the entire basin as far as Manitoba. So it's all linked, and we're beginning to see how much the linkages are, how extraordinary teleconnected the system is. And you do one thing in one place, and it can affect things very much further downstream. And we need to understand that. An agency can help us, but our understanding of a group like Rotary, of the need for this, can also support us in trying to create a really effective Canada Water Agency, which we hope will happen this year.
Okay. Bob, I'm going to move us into a bit of a kind of a political lead question here. Although Rotarians believe we are apolitical, Mother Earth is apolitical too, right? It's our home, one and only home. We have a Rotarian who is asking, how can we speak to our political leaders to accept this new enlightenment that any development now within our communities needs to be paused, put the brakes on, so to speak. He goes on to write, or she goes on to write, even when the scientists have pleaded with our political leaders to pause destructive development, what do we say to them? Do we get down on our knees and make them listen to the science?
I think this is a really important question, and I think that this is a transformational moment with respect to the answer to that question. One of the things that our society has done, and especially special interests, is they've downloaded all of the problems that we face with respect to environmental issues and right up to our system change and its significant expression as climate change. They've downloaded the responsibilities to us. You consume less, you fly less, we're gonna meat shame you, we're gonna do all of these other things until you change your behavior. And in a way, that distracts us from the fact that we desperately need systemic change as well. It's important that individuals do their part, but we need to make sure that our political leaders understand that it's not just individual behavior that has to change. We have to have systemic change, and it's that for which they are responsible also. And they have to look at a larger picture and move out of the structures so that we have used to make decision-making in the past to realize the real threat we have, but also to realize the real opportunity we have to halt this and to create richer, more diverse, healthier communities and societies. And I think we need to press them to do that, and we need to use science as the basis. COVID has taught us a lot about this. Really, it was only 314 days before the sequence of the virus was properly identified, before a vaccine was actually approved. We know who we can trust, and we can trust science. Mm-hmm. And we also know, as a result of COVID, the areas in our society that have broken down, and it's there we need to concentrate, and we need to use science to do that.
Bob, we only have a few minutes left, and I got a couple in just almost on the same time marker. So I'll proceed with Rotarian Paul Carrick. As a Rotarian, I am a universalist, a global citizen. The Arctic is a carbon chimney. Will the loss of permafrost and the resulting methane not rise the global temperature by almost 4 degrees? And at 4 degrees, is not life for humans under extreme threat? Bob?
Well, it depends on how. One of the things that really frightens us is the rate at which permafrost thaw has accelerated. And if anyone knows the Arctic is really, there's an enormous amount of hydrocarbons under there from the formations that were made in earlier warm periods. And the permafrost and ice there is really an incomplete cap over all of that. And if you let that melt, then all of those hydrocarbons are going to be gradually released over time. And there's a huge volume there. And if that happens, and if it gets out of control, it's going to change the entire global climate system. And that's why we want to avoid it. Mm-hmm. So yes, if that happens, we have to recognize that by mid-century, we would be living in a very different Canadian West. So we have to pay very close attention on it. We have to take it seriously. And there are people also, I was on a global webinar with some of the world's leading climate scientists just last Saturday. And there are people who feel that we've got to get moving on this. That 2030 even might be too late if these sorts of things get moving. So I think urgency is the thing that has been missing. And I know that Paul, as a universalist, recognizes the impacts will be widespread, and they will affect also the most vulnerable first and most deeply. Mm-hmm. And if we care about the world, and Rotary does, you've gone all over the world to help. This is one threat that we have to take seriously and act upon now.
Bob, looking at engagement and universality of world organizations, Steve Gasser is asking, can you outline more specifically which of the UN's SDGs would apply to Rotary interest in the environment?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, well, first of all, you have to see the SDGs not as individual. I know we portray them this way in little boxes, but it's really a moral and biological and social ecology. Each one of those boxes relates to one another. And I have found ways to explain. I don't have time now to show you, but I can show you how by taking care of water resources, you'll meet the other 16 SDGs in one way or another. You'll contribute to the success. Now, in answering Steve's question, you look at your 7 avenues, I mean, and they are an ecology too. They're interlinked. They're a moral, social, environmental, political ecology. And I think that ecology could apply in whatever way you thought appropriate, if you thought about it, to any of the SDGs. And you might want to look at your ecology again and see how it overlaps with the SDGs and how you can nest what you're doing in the larger objectives that we have for the rest of the world. And I know that through groups like yours, and one other comment, that we can do this. And one other comment, we should never underestimate the fact that the United States has renewed its commitments to the United Nations, in particular to the Paris Accord. Without that, and if there would have been a second term of the former president, we would be facing a very, very serious planetary emergency. So we need to work with them, as I said before, be in lockstep with them and help the world understand how serious this problem is and how important it is to act now so that we can stem it, so that it reduces its impact and helps us build a better world for the future.
Bob, I have 2 more questions before we wrap up tonight. One is from Victor Maris. Says, Bob, would you agree that our farm soil is in better shape now due to much enhanced technologies in farm practice compared to the dirty 30s? What would you?
Oh yes. There's no question. No-till and so many of these regenerative agricultural practices are way, well, of course, the 30s. That was a low period of. That was when we lost many of our soils. Yes, they are, but unfortunately, what we're still doing on a global basis is we're replacing the microbes and the interactions that take place within healthy soil with fertilization and farming practices with monocultures. And this has caused damage to our soil health. And farmers working on regenerative agriculture are seeing that it's possible to restore that soil health, bring the microbes back, and allow 3 things to happen. First of all, richer, deeper, healthier soil can absorb more water during floods, reducing flood damage. It also retains more water during drought periods and releases it more slowly. But more importantly, it absorbs enormous amounts of carbon dioxide. It's held in some circles that if improved soil health could take 25% of the carbon dioxide that's currently been put into the atmosphere by human activities out of the atmosphere and sequester it in soils.
Bob, I'm going to wrap up with a combined question submitted by Graham Locke and Jim Smith. Graham kind of gives it to me in a few sections, so Graham, I hope I captured for you. The rock industry of the Bow Valley dwarfs and GHG, that of all over Canada or Canmore emits, perhaps carbon sequestration would help, full colon. Jim is asking, hi, Bob, would you please share your thoughts on the Eastern Slopes Coal Initiative? Thanks. Sure. Try to get into both of those in 60 seconds.
Well, it's really interesting. 10 years ago, maybe even longer, we worked with Lafarge on thinking about how best to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. It was really funny at the time because what I would do is I have a carbon dioxide concentration meter And I could always tell when the wind was blowing from Exshaw, because the carbon dioxide concentration would go up several parts per million when the wind was blowing in that way. Cement production is one of the largest CO2 emitters on the planet. And the reason for that is very simple. It's chemistry. To get cement, you take limestone and you bake the CO2 out of it. But since then, Lafarge has gone on to massively increase their CO2 emissions. There is talk now of different ways of creating cement and different kinds of cement that are being investigated. Those are still pilot projects as far as I can see, although there have been some breakthroughs. So we're going to have to wait to see how that industry responds. And again, this is part of the systemic change that we need to think about, and how we build what we use cement for and how much of it we produce. And boy, there's some really interesting things in China. In a 10-year period, they used more cement than the US did in the last century. So there are places that are going to need to reconsider how they do things. And I should tell you one thing, there's not enough cement that we could produce in the world to protect us from the kind of an extent of sea level rise that we might see by 2050 if we don't get a handle on this. There are 200 million people who are threatened with climate and civic related involuntary human migration, and Paul Carrick knows all about this too. So these are things that are all linked, and you can't pull one thread without getting the entire carpet with you, and it's a big one.
So Bob, slide over now to the eastern slopes.
All right.
Well, there was
okay.
a question, I think, looking at certain things that have been in the news lately. I'm going to think with respect to mining and water.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah.
Working with Global Water Futures and having an experience of water in the West, and knowing that the Mountain West is the headwaters of 3 of the greatest rivers and most of the river water in the entire West, I strenuously oppose coal mining in the upper reaches of the Old Man. It is unwise to do so. The other thing too is that we're seeing more and more that there's a call from not just climate scientists that we've got to stop fossil fuel development, coal mining, oil and gas now, because we can't afford new projects that will increase the CO2 emissions and make it harder for us to reduce them through resilient and natural or renewable energy sources. Mm-hmm. So looking at that, I have to say that I was tremendously disappointed with the comments of the Environment Minister, who said that there will be limited or no impacts on water in coal mining. I should just say that the formation that they're mining is exactly the formation that's being mined in the Elk Valley. And they have had such serious problems with selenium releases, which now have residence times of up to 2,000 years, that they have had to bring a fresh supply of water to the community because they can't drink it. Mm-hmm. And once you start doing that, you're talking about damage that doesn't last just for generations. It can last for millennia. Mm-hmm. And with the temperature increase in the prairies expected to be as much as 9 degrees by mid-century, water is going to be a precious element, precious beyond imagination. Mm-hmm. And we need to understand that. And instead of going backwards, we should move our economy and our society forwards. And that mining proposition is not going to do it for us.
Bob, thank you very much for your evening on behalf of my fellow Rotarians. I applaud you, I encourage you. I'm glad you've put some things up there that those with the inquisitive minds can track down some reading sources. And I'm sure if I ask you for a few more references to share with our Rotarians, you would do so. So with that, Bob, thank you very much. And I bid all my fellow Rotarians a good evening.
Thank you, Brian, very much.
For now.